Hi, and welcome to Enough Room, a Symphony Nova Scotia project about expanding our musical horizons, in which Daniel Bartholomew Poyser and myself will be discussing all sorts of issues about programming and personnel and what we can be doing in the arts in this time in the world. And today's guest is Raeesa Lalani, who's Artistic Director of Prismatic Arts Festival. Hi, Raeesa.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you ended up working for Prismatic and what your background is as a
Sure,
performer or an artist?
absolutely. So I'm actually from Wichipsa Oyed, Calgary, from Treaty 7 of Blackfoot Territory. And I moved out to Jabukduk here in Mi'kmahi, Halifax, Nova Scotia, for university. And I came here to pursue the arts, to do the acting program at Dalhousie University. And I was also on a volleyball scholarship, so a nice blend of athletics and arts. And I ended up deciding to kind of change my course of action to study journalism instead, because I was really interested in kind of, the broadcast world and telling people's stories, telling the truth and the facts and the realness of people's stories. And so I started doing that. And then I kind of found myself called back to the arts. I mean, I've been singing and playing the piano and dancing since I could speak, walk. I've been on stages my whole life. And I found that my professional life and my artistic desire to get back to that life kind of came full circle and came together, which was really exciting. So I started with the Prismatic Arts Festival in 2016, doing their marketing and communications, and then moved on to be the producer, and now I'm the newest artistic director.
That's quite amazing to move up an organisation like
Yeah,
that. Like often artistic directors are outside appointments so that it's fresh ideas or, but to move upwards to that position is
yeah.
really amazing. Do you feel that having come through the organisation is helpful to you in your position?
Absolutely. I think it really makes who I am and what my intentions are with the position. Just learning the industry, learning the organization's values and mandates, which I hold close to my own heart as well, and then being able to be put into a position where I can make a difference, which I think is really special. So I think having two incredible mentors in Shaheen Siadi, Maggie Stewart, our executive director and managing director, and seeing and understanding and learning. And I will tell that story too, about how Prismatic came to be. What were the battles? What were the strife that people had to go through, that Indigenous artists and artists of color have gone through to even have a need for a platform like Prismatic. I think just being inside that organization and meeting artists and meeting people, stakeholders within the industry through the organization has really kind of given me a lot of thought and a lot of clarity of what I need to do to move forward.
That's so interesting that it's not just that you inform the process of the organisation, but that the organisation and your place in it informs your personal professional development as well. Is
Absolutely.
kind of, we don't think about that often when, especially at the beginning of your career, when you're going for jobs, you're just so blimmin' grateful to be hired sometimes, but often it is amazing
Absolutely,
to sit
for
and think,
sure.
no, is this going to help me grow and not just in an ambition kind of sense, but in a, as you say, a value driven sense, or an ethical
Yeah.
sense. Um,
Yeah, I think it's lucky that I think, I'm lucky that I'm in a position where my job is something that betters me every day, that excites me every day. A lot of people don't have the opportunity to say that. And I mean, especially now within this COVID-19 pandemic, everyone's just, fighting to get by. And what life was as we knew it is completely turned upside down. Our art sector as a whole has been completely turned upside down. So I just count my blessings every day that, I get to do something that I love and that keeps me going, and I get to keep it going.
so there's one little thing I want to sort of highlight for our audience who are listening, in case they're unaware. The
Mhm.
prismatic, you kind of referred to it quite briefly, but Prismatic does work specifically to be a platform for the art and artists of the Indigenous community and the Black community. Is that correct? And for people of colour?
So Prismatic we're a multidisciplinary annual festival that solely showcases the work of Indigenous artists and artists of color from across Canada. We have also programmed Indigenous artists and artists of color from beyond, and we have had international either presenters or artists on our stage. But right now, in the past year or so, our focus has really come back to the Canadian artists and to make sure that we're providing a stage for Indigenous artists and artists of color from Canada. Which actually, maybe I'll tell my story if you don't mind. I'll use that as a segue, which is great. It's not my story; it's Prismatic's story, but I consider it to be, a part of my story now too. So the Prismatic Arts Festival actually started in 2008, and we'll even go before that a little bit. So our executive director, Shaheen Siadi, he came to Dalhousie University, went through the Fountain School of Performing Arts, and was looking to build a career in the arts here in Halifax. And there was just such a, to be blunt about it, such a lack of opportunity for an artist of color with an accent to be programmed, or to even, work as a director or a producer, or to be a tech. And of course, he wanted to act, and that was what his passion was. And there was no place for him to do it. And because of that recognition of that need and the necessity of, well, I want to make it in this sector, what am I going to do? So he actually worked at a grocery store and owned a grocery store and started a theater company out of the back of a grocery store. And that was One Light Theater. And it was called One Light Theater because there was just one light in the back of the grocery store in the theater that kind of shaped, and gave him a platform to start writing his work and creating. And through that, he recognized that he was able to, with a lot of determination and grit, if you ever get the chance to meet him, you'll see, that it wasn't just for him that it was important to do. Now it was really important to do that for the whole sector, for Indigenous artists and artists of color in Canada as a whole. And so the Prismatic Arts Festival kind of was an idea that came out of One Light Theater, and One Light Theater actually produced it. It was just a 2-hour program at Neptune Studio at the Neptune Theater in downtown Halifax. And from there, it grew so immensely. It picked up because people, audiences were interested in learning about new, art forms, about new information that's disseminated through the art, but also, artists of color started hearing about this festival on the East Coast of Canada that presents work by them, which is, it was unheard of even 10, 15 years ago. It still is a struggle to this day. So that's kind of the story of how Prismatic came to be. And it is curated to solely showcase Indigenous artists and artists of color. But even in that, we do prioritize the works of artists who identify in communities that are underrepresented in Canadian professional arts, which include women, members of the LGBTQI2S+ community, disability identified artists, all under that umbrella of Indigenous artists and artists of color. So that's kind of the overview of how Prismatic came to be and what we do.
That is amazing. And that's so wonderfully kind of Berlin art house to have the One Light Theater out the back of a grocery store.
I wish I could have seen it. I always hear the stories and I look at the pictures and I was like, oh, I wish I was born like 20 years ago because I could have seen what it was all about, which is incredible.
I think there's an argument for reinstating the One Light Theater and actually running a little series there because I think it's so
record.
Cool. Yeah.
It's on record. We have to make it happen. One Light Theater still is a company that does exist to this day.
Okay.
Just not where it is in the grocery store.
So I have so many questions for you coming out of all of that, because to the people watching, I didn't know any of that. I'm discovering this at the same time as everyone who's watching, which is really cool. So first of all, I want to talk about this thing of the time we're in at the moment, because we can't not talk about COVID, number one, and the pandemic and the lockdown, but also the other massive event that's happened to impact all of us globally in the same way. It has been the Black Lives Matter movement this year, which has been just the most amazing explosion of energy and kind of mission about going, no, enough is enough, being polite about this hasn't worked. And it feels like it's just like a fire hose has gone on on the world. It's just been amazing. So you were mentioning that Prismatic also represents other underrepresented groups, such as people with disabilities. And in the UK, I'm on the board, a director on the board of an opera company that is specifically for and about and starts from the germ of accessibility for people with disabilities to be on stage, to be in the audience, etc. And one thing we've talked about, and it's become clear to us, is that actually the disabled community have sort of, in many ways, reveled in this time artistically, because they're like, well, we've been using these aids all the time. We just called them, Zoom was all these online meetings, all of these sort of technology things that we're having to rely on at the moment. We've been using them for years and being told that it meant it wasn't the right kind of access. Now the whole world needs it. All of a sudden it's mainstream. Do you think there's a sense of that also for, say, people of colour or an Indigenous community who already have faced barriers of access and direct connection to audience, that actually this kind of levels the playing field in some ways of, well, there's a wealth of experience already in this creative community to equip them to deal with this perhaps a little more speedily and fleetly than the mainstream community?
I mean, that's an interesting kind of perspective, I guess, because I mean, that is, for example, like the Black Lives Matter movement that you're talking about, that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been trying to do for 10, 15 years. That's what artists of color have been asking for, all of time. So I think the fact now that it's being more public, and I think that, it is a correlation to the pandemic shutting us all down and being so connected on our phones. And that's why it really kind of took off on social media, because everyone was just so connected and so aware of what was going on at immediate time, which is what social media can do. I think it's great that it is now in the public's mind. But I mean, if you spoke to an artist of color, like they've been battling this battle, like you said about, artists with disabilities, they've been battling this battle forever. And now the fact of the matter is that if people are understanding and people are acknowledging it, well, what are they going to do to reconcile? Does that mean that a person of color is now still a checkbox for your stage because now you have to be inclusive? No, it's about equity over equality, and it's about awarding those equal opportunities. But also just, recognizing that this is a battle that has been happening. It's just that people are aware of it now and people are understanding it now, and that they need to, be mindful of, when asking for an Indigenous artist's perspective or asking an artist of color to be a part of their show, what has the colonial institutions done to them, and how have they treated them, and how are you going to reprimand that and make it better?
Yeah. One thing we've talked about a bit at Symphony Nova Scotia with the audience, but also within meetings, closed meetings, is this thing that there's this tremendous energy to be programming differently, not entirely differently, but and as per the title of this series, there's enough room. You don't have to throw Beethoven out to allow Florence Price in. They can sit really happily next to each other. And one of the issues we face with classical music in particular is that the point at which concerts become commodified and it's something that you purchase, you pay to buy access to it, then you get a slight sense of, therefore you need to perform for me something that, everyone has a different thing they want to get out of it. It's a transaction. And I'm curious to see for myself how our audience and therefore our marketing team and the ticketing department can navigate this thing of, we're going to have another crack at programming all of this stuff, but it means you need to buy the tickets. It doesn't work if you don't come. And what I'm curious to know is, at Prismatic, you talked about that wonderful thing that there was a point at which the founder, it stopped being about what he needed to do for himself, and he realized there was a need from others, which is something I've been thinking about recently in terms of the tech world. Actually, a lot of apps and software started off as a personal project to fill a personal need, and all of a sudden there were people getting in touch saying, I need it too. So when Prismatic started to grow and have an established audience wanting more, was it a sort of a settler audience, or was it an Indigenous and BIPOC audience? Was it
Right.
who was buying the tickets to make sure that the festival could grow?
That's a really good question. And I think, so for example, our motto is art for everyone. So we never, try to silo artists within their own communities and market the shows to that. For us, it's art is for everyone. The most important thing is people who want to see a really good theater show, come to this show that we're bringing you. People who want to see a musician, or you want to hear music you've never heard before, come to this show. So I think the biggest thing for us, and I think that would be pertinent in relation to your question and what you're looking to do as well, is the organization has to build that trust within their audiences. And we have a really, like, we call our audience our Prismatic family. Our volunteers have been volunteering with us for 15 years. They always want to come back. It's really, on the greater level of reconciliation, it's really important about that relationship building. So for us, we never hide who we are, what we're trying to do. This is who we are. It's on the page blank. You know what we're doing. But, we also trust and come and see that this is going to be a good show. Or maybe you won't like it and it evoked a bunch of emotion in you, whatever it is. That's what art is for. That's what it does. But we, really built that trust with other organizations, our audience members that we've had, with our funders, with anyone. We're very transparent about who we are and what our intention is. And, we believe in what we're doing, and we want you to believe us too. And the people that will do that. And I think, for example, we actually did work with Symphony Nova Scotia a couple of years ago, and we had Chris Dirksen, who is an incredible Indigenous cellist and composer. And, she was classically trained on the cello, and her sound is very much like electronic looping, a very electronic sound with the cello. But she has kind of, the Western classical technique and background. But then she composed music and composed her new album. It was called Indigenous Powwow, and it was all about the music and the traditional sounds that she's heard growing up. And she merged those two worlds together. And we had the pleasure of having members of Symphony Nova Scotia, learn her music and play with her on the stage. And that was like just this beautiful blend of both worlds. And I think that's something that people really think about in the classical canon, is we are very well versed in the westernized classical canon. But there's an Eastern classical canon as well. And there's when you talk about classical music, we're so one streamlined into one type of classical music, and it's very much the colonized version of classical music. But there is so much other classical music out there from different, people with different backgrounds, different countries. There's different instruments. So I think it's, rather than having kind of that either or mentality where one reigns as the supreme and the other doesn't have a place, it's time to open up and accept and coexist. And, there is room for all. There is room for everything. And, I was speaking actually just earlier today with Dinuk Wajaratne, who's, been in the Prismatic family forever. He's been on our stage a lot, and we were kind of having that conversation about it. And he's like, classical music is a blank slate, and it's a place for you to tell your story. And he's like, I love Mozart. Like, I, grew up in the British system for education, and that was, I heard Mozart and I wanted to learn how to play that music. But then I also started bringing, my background into it. And I love the sound of Indian music and Sri Lankan music, and bringing those worlds together. But he is so happy that he has that technical training, from one canon, but it doesn't mean that you have to be siloed into that. I think there is, that openness and existing and, creating sounds. Like there's Jeremy Dutcher now, who's, really famous, and everyone is absolutely, enjoying hearing his music. He's classically trained on the piano here at Dalhousie University, yet he blends voices and sounds from his ancestors to make his music. So I think there's, a world of being able to just be open and learning about coexisting.
We had actually had a piece by Chris Dirksen planned for this season.
My heart.
I know. It was like, it was going to be such a cool program.
Yeah, she's incredible.
Yeah.
She's so unbelievably talented. Anyone who's watching, just like Google Chris Dirksen right now.
Yeah, definitely.
It's worth
it. and that we will be reprogramming that one.
Great.
It's going to be a nice project for next season. Fingers crossed. If the world's ready for such things,
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? So there's something interesting that comes up in that, and this is, I don't think either of us have the answer for this, but I've heard people say that the word, when we talk about programming as opposed to curating, and you use the word curation, and I know that the cynicists in the world would say, oh, that's just such a woke kind of millennial term, but actually all you're doing is programming. But I actually genuinely think there is a difference between the two, and I'm interested to know whether you use the word curation intentionally to differentiate it from programming, or if you see those as different tasks, or
Yeah, I mean, I personally see them as different tasks. I like the positivity that surrounds the word curating a little bit more, and I think it leaves it open for the artist's input, and that's something that's really important for us at Prismatic. Is we are our two main principles and how we govern our organization is, one is the artist and the other is race politics, and those are the two main factors that kind of make us who we are. So I think for us, whether it's commissioning a work or working with emerging artists or presenting professional artists, I think what matters to us is hearing what the artist needs. What are their desires? What can we do for them? And I think in a process of curation, to me, that means that those conversations are being had rather than me saying, oh, I've gone to this showcase like this, programming you in my next festival, here's your offer. I think there's so much more to it than me, and I think everyone can interpret the words differently. I think that's maybe just the way I see it. But for me, that curation process is relationship building. It's getting to know the artist. It's asking the artist what they need. It's working together to have that common goal of the presentation or workshop or masterclass or whatever it is.
I mean, it almost sounds like co-creation, a co-curation rather than co-creation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there is a work that they have that's already ready to go, I mean, yes, we will program that, but I don't know. I don't think we've ever really used the word programming. I think because for us, it's always been about the collective.
I find this fascinating because as you were saying, I was thinking, oh God, I hadn't even thought about what the artist needs out of it, because that just does not come into it with classical music. The primacy of the score and the piece and the composer is all, and we all are subject to it. And in particular, the kind of the canonic esteem of the composer and reverence and all of this kind of stuff. And if there's something that sets classical music and perhaps ballet, as opposed to dance, apart from the other performing art forms, it's that there is so little improvisation and input of the artist into it. We recreate. We don't create, we recreate. And the more recreative it is, i.e. closer to the text, the better it's thought we've done it. Do you know what I mean? The less of ourselves that's in it, actually, the better we've done our job.
Right.
So I wonder if that's why traditionally in classical music it has been more a sense of programming, i.e. there is a model which should be followed because the canonic history is such a crucial part of the value system.
I mean, that makes sense. Even just, I didn't know that specifically. But I think that does make sense because it is a program. It is, it's Mozart's sonata, or it is what it is. It is a program that is being done in a very specific way. And kind of like you were saying, going back to, your audiences and the tickets, like they're buying the program. They're buying exactly what they know they're going to get, and they're expecting it in a certain way. And that's the way it's going to be. And that's what they're looking for. And I mean, I think there's a place for all art and all art forms for sure, but I think that might be what our differentiation is in the words of programming and curation for sure.
And for me, curation I think is a far healthier concept, and I hope that's what we can move towards in classical music, where it's more, which for me as a musician would feel like I'm going to create a conceptual room for you with a whole lot of toys in it, and they're called bits of music, and you can come into this conceptual room for an hour and a half and play with the toys. And some of them might be fun to play with, some of them might be a bit scary, some of them you might like, whatever, and then you leave the little conceptual room. So curation, I suppose, for me, I've always thought about it as in terms of the audience's experience within it. So it's creating an environment for an audience to have an experience in, rather than making a product to sell to them.
Interesting. I like that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My husband's a conductor as well, and he does a lot more avant-garde new music than I do. But we had this discussion near the beginning of lockdown of what happens if you just don't advertise what the works will be in a classical program? How would an audience respond? Would they be freaked out by it? Would they be intrigued? Would they be titillated? Would they want to then send you an email and go, well, if you haven't chosen yet, I'd really love you to do blah, blah, blah. Could it actually become a discussion?
They're going to do it now.
Which I think is a fascinating thought. I mean, there are myriad practical considerations that make that difficult. But I think it's interesting maybe for audience members to think about, what if I didn't come to a concert because I have a sense of the beauty or esteem or famousness of the person playing it, if it's a concerto, or the person who wrote it? What if it is just turn up and I'm going to play you something in D major, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I can promise you it will be in D major, and just leave it at that,
Totally.
I
think that's really interesting.
In terms of Prismatic, have you played around with improvisation, any sort of improv sort of things, or are they generally quite set pieces that you do?
So we program. There you go. Here you go. Program. We put together our artistic vision for our festival about a year in advance. So a lot of what we present are works that are created by artists. So I kind of touched on it earlier, but we either present fully actualized works by the artist and they bring it to us and say, this is our work, this is what we need, this is what we want to do, and they perform it. Or sometimes there are times where we commission work. So we work with different artists to help them realize and actualize their vision. So for example, the Mariachi Ghost, they're an incredible band, musicians. They wanted to do a rock opera, and they're musicians. This was kind of outside of their scope, and knowing that Shaheen, works in theater and has all of that, he kind of mentored the band, and they actually did a workshop presentation at 1 year at Prismatic, and then the next year they did their full presentation of it, and you could see kind of how it morphed and changed. And the audiences here, they had come previous to the festival, so they kind of had a little bit of a following here, and the audiences came to the workshop presentation and immediately were like, oh, this was awesome, this is our feedback, this is what we want to say, like it was too long or it was too short or this, and they wanted to be involved in the process. And I think we had maybe just launched the tickets the following year and it was completely sold out, which was super exciting. But yeah, I think for us it's very much either taking a realized work, helping commission works and creating new works, or even giving that stage, the main stage, to emerging artists that haven't had an opportunity to do that. I think I'm going on a tangent a little bit.
No, this is brilliant. This is wonderful. I love that idea. And this actually goes back to something you said earlier, about it could be that an audience member comes along and doesn't enjoy it. And it's as an audience, often that's something we deprive ourselves of, is the opportunity to go and hear stuff we think is not very good, or that we don't enjoy, or that we found a bit scary to listen to, or that we preferred the second piece. All of these are valid responses. I did a concert in Berlin once, in this amazing venue, the Piano Salon, which has just got all these carcasses of dead grand pianos all around the room. It's the most amazing space. And I did a concert of pieces by New Zealand composers of various levels of experience. And there was this guy, I didn't even know him. He just got in touch through social media or something. And he came along, he was German, and he came up afterwards. I don't think he'd ever heard any contemporary music. And he said, that was awful. That was terrible. When's the next concert? I will buy a ticket. And for him, the fact that it had incensed him was enough to make him want to come back and be incensed again, because it was a reaction. It was an engagement with the piece. He didn't have to find it nice, No. It was tremendous. It was such a great response.
Well, and I think that's really important too. I mean, art obviously, is meant to be enjoyed, but it's also there to elicit emotion. And I think that's something that, we find is really important when we're putting on our performances, is we actually have a lot of artists talkbacks right after the show. And that's something that we've kind of implemented almost as a standard to the majority of our shows, especially theater and dance, where there's the opportunity for that. And, audience members don't have to stay. They can leave or they can stay. And it just gives that that opportunity to actually talk to the artist and reflect on it. And especially for us, you know, when we have different artists of color, indigenous artists that are, a lot of their art is shaped by who they are, their culture, their traditions, and there is that need for knowledge sharing between the artist and the audience. So we've found that that has been really important and helpful. And, you know, I remember we had Santee Smith's The Mush Hole. It debuted at Prismatic, and we had, and it's about residential schools, and it's very tough content. Like there's not, it's beautiful. She's one of the most incredibly talented dancers I've ever seen on a stage. So it was incredibly beautiful to watch, but the actual themes and what was happening in it was very, very hard. But this is a way to get, you know, their story of what has happened onto a stage. And we had invited a bunch of schools from all around the province, high school students, because we identified, you know, that was the appropriate age group for it. And I remember after we had the artist talkback, and a lot of the artists within that show were also under 18, like they were youth themselves because they were representing students. And I remember, you know, one girl had put her hand up and asked the question to one of the dancers and said, so what was happening there? And, you know, he talked about it, and I'll throw a trigger warning out there for anyone, if they're watching right now, skip ahead a few seconds. If any sort of abuse triggers you, please. And he answered and he said, oh, I was being molested in that. And you should, the girl, her face, she was just like, oh, like mortified that she asked that question. And then, you know, it was silence, and he was talking about it and you know, explaining, this is the history of my family members. This is what they've gone through. And, you know, there was such a silence in the room. It was deafening, the silence in the room. It just, you know, within 30, 45 seconds, you saw 3 or 4 other hands going up, and they wanted to talk and they wanted to learn more. And, you know, that kind of barrier had been broken. And, you know, almost by accident, seemingly, I think she was just asking what was happening there because she really, you know, enjoyed the movements or whatever it may have been. And that sparked a conversation that I think lasted almost an hour, of just the artist being able to talk and say, this is our art form, this is what we're doing. And, you know, I can guarantee people leaving that room, it wasn't just oh, we got to show a dance show and skipped our class. There was a lot of emotions that I assure you was brewing, and there was a lot of, you know, thoughts and feelings, and maybe people even went home to check out their history books and learn about it. So there's, you know, there's so much more impact that art can have on someone. And I think that's really important, you know, as an audience member to understand, like, you don't have to like it, but you can learn about it, you can hear it, you can experience new things. I think that's really important.
And actually, as you're talking about that, I thought of my experience as an opera. And we sort of have the reverse thing where blatantly a lot of opera is, again, a trigger warning here, is about sexual abuse, abuse of power, rape, murder, domestic abuse. And blatantly, I mean, you cannot, any intelligent person of the 21st century cannot read these synopses and not admit that it is. But of course, it's been couched in this beautiful, romantic, sexualized, often sensualized at least, music. And for 100, 150 years been designed, directed, and conducted by a demographic of people who are statistically far less likely to be victims of those kind of abuses. So say you think about Carmen, for instance, as an opera. I mean, it is such an opera, such a story for our times. It's about refugees, it's about illegal immigration, it's about sex work, it's about stalking. It's, you know, there is no love in there. There's not a single romantic scene. It's about abuse. But of course, we haven't grown up thinking of it that way, and it has these soaring romantic melodies. So people we sit watching it thinking we're watching a love story, and it kind of normalizes the themes in it because we don't frame it honestly. Same with Rigoletto, same thing. And often this comes up when we talk about repertoire and enough room for broadening our repertoire, for instance. Should we be throwing these works out? And I've grappled with this. I mean, there's a lot of opera repertoire I actually just don't particularly like the music of. I can't stand the Italian bel canto, for instance. But I think actually there are stories in there that are still important to tell because they've not necessarily been told well, or intelligently or critically. So part of broadening the way we do it is also broadening the way we say it. And say, as a female conductor, I mean, conducting is one of those jobs that I think there are 3% of conductors are women. And if you want to look at people of colour, that's going to be smaller still, particularly women. It's pretty scary. We're very much stuck in the 17th century. So yay, Symphony Nova Scotia. But just by, I've reflected on this a lot, and I talked to Daniel Bartholomew Poyser about this as well, just by putting someone on the podium or in a position of leadership in the arts, you get a slightly different opinion on something. And it won't be that I conduct Beethoven differently because I'm a woman or anything like that, but it could be differences in the way we, say, enact leadership in the rehearsal room. It could be as simple as that it's just different people from different backgrounds bring a different way of leadership, a different way of relating to the audience, a different way of curating or programming. So when we talk about there being enough room and broadening our musical or artistic palette, it can actually be about taking a second look at what we've been taking for granted for 50 years, can't it? I mean, do you ever have repertoire with a capital R at Prismatic? Does anyone ever come and perform, say, Shakespeare?
No, because a big part of our presenting is presenting new works or new creations. So we don't, we haven't staged. And I know when we were kind of talking offline, you were like, what's your most exciting thing that you want to have at your venue? If you had no budget, your venue of your dreams, what would you do? And I was like, I would do what we did this year, and I do what I want to do next year. And that's, that cross collaboration and creating new work. Because I think that's really important. And, obviously that's our mandate and who we are and what we're doing, but just giving the resources and the ability for artists to create their own new works. Like, we don't really I think that's a big differentiation probably from us in the classical world. Or what, a symphony does is we program new works of art.
Well, now I can't ask you that question on camera.
Because
I know what your answer's going to be.
I mean, this answer was like kind of anyway, so you can ask it.
I mean, is there a dream project to produce for you that you think, if I had the budget, I'd get that artist in and team them with this person and set up a collaboration?
Absolutely. I was like really thinking it over of what would my dream project be. And, I kind of got a little bit of a taste of it this year with our project Shifting Verse, which was in partnership with the National Arts Center for the Grand Acts of Theatre. And it was, in response to COVID. And, it was, create a work. What do you want to do? And for me, the most important thing was everyone has, artists, rather than being a blanket statement, but the artists that, we work with or the artists that we know are so talented and they have so many ideas, and it's just about, providing, and that is who we are, again, is what we do is those, artists from marginalized communities that don't have the ability or the options or the resources to do it, the ideas that are brewing there. And if they had the opportunities to actually create the work that they want to create, for me, like, that would be the biggest project I could ever put together. And we kind of, did that in a different way. This year we had representation from all Atlantic provinces to put together this grand act of theater. And I had a choreographer from Nova Scotia, and I had a musician from Nova Scotia, and some artists from Newfoundland, and our projections were from PEI. And we just got to bring together all of these people. And, I had this idea. This is, the theme of what I want it to look like, but I'm not going to be like, okay, you have to do exactly this, and this is what you're doing. It was like, this is the world that I'm creating. What does the dance movement look like for it? And that creation was created. And then the script was created, and the music is created, and putting it all together. I mean, I'm still reeling from it. It was incredible. So I just want to keep doing that.
I mean, it sounds like one of those, the sum total is greater than the sum of its parts, if you know what I mean, actually, by bringing all of those different ingredients together and giving them freedom to interact as they happen to, then actually what comes out is better than anything we could micromanage.
Exactly.
Which is another kind of very typical side of classical music is micromanagement.
Right.
Okay, that's fascinating. I find that very interesting. So, I have two final questions. The
Sure.
first is more of a provocation, and that's, well, just something that I've found interesting during lockdown is that two dichotomies have been upset. Number one, the moment lockdown happened, or very shortly after, all of a sudden this sliding scale between professional and amateur was obliterated. It was just people creating online. There was just no difference between a 15-year-old videoing herself practicing ballet in her kitchen and someone from the Royal Ballet. They had the same number of viewers, they had the same kind of content, and it had the same value in terms of what it was doing and what it was saying. But the other thing that I think is really has come later during lockdown is our attention turning inward and closer to home, and a renewed sense of value in terms of local artists. And this has been fascinating for me as a New Zealander, because the New Zealand orchestras are very traditional, and they of course have these concert programs that they have to get foreign conductors in to conduct, because none of us can afford to stay in New Zealand. There won't be enough work to sustain us. And so, and also it's good to travel and broaden your perspectives. But it meant that, they're sitting there with no COVID basically, so a fully functioning concert season, but no conductors. So they've been having to bring all of these New Zealanders that perhaps they wouldn't normally hire back into the country. And the same with soloists. They're using players from within their own orchestras to play the concerto instead of getting famous people from Europe or North America. So it's a shift of values in that way, born of necessity, but actually I think it has sparked something genuinely like, oh, why weren't we doing this all along? For some of them. And we can start to see the same thing here happening in the UK for very practical reasons, that you just can't bank on the fact that someone from mainland Europe can come in without having to quarantine, or will, so there are practical reasons for it happening here as well. But in terms of, say, a community like Nova Scotia, or even if we look more at the whole Atlantic bubble, because artists can flow freely within that Atlantic bubble at the moment, what constitutes local now is a completely different concept than what it did, say, 50 or 80 years ago, when a lot of these organizations were setting up. So local artists might come from the most broad group of diasporas and backgrounds, and I don't know, just tell me what you think about it. What is your sense of local people, local artists, and who do we think of as a local audience as well, because that's a very different thing in a globalized world, isn't it?
For sure. I think the main thing, kind of to articulate first with that is, for us here in Canada on Turtle Island, the Indigenous people are the original people and caretakers of the land. And it is really important for us in this time right now of reconciliation to give them back their identity. So as soon as you said the word local, like that was the immediate thought that came to my mind. But in saying that as well, Canada is also one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and has a very wide range of people. So for me, I'm first generation Canadian. I'm Canadian. I now live in Halifax. I'm local to Halifax. My parents are from Africa. My great-great-grandparents are from India. So like, where does that, that this is like, we're going to unpack some things here. but that is, the question, especially for Indigenous artists, which we kind of touched on that, and artists of color, which is what I'm going with now, is where do you belong? What is your home? Where do you belong? What is your identity? What is your city's identity? What is your province identity? And I think traditionally, on the East Coast, specifically of Canada, the identity has always kind of been, like the Gaelic and the Celtic identity. And people who think of the East Coast of Canada, will think of, our industries like fishing and things like that, and seafood and all those things. But if you also look, we also have Africville, and one of the oldest Black communities in Canada here on the East Coast as well. So I think it's really, I think without getting too political with that, to kind of bring it back to the arts, I think local for me personally would be where you are located and what do you identify as home. Like I would say I'm a Haligonian. When I think local, like Halifax is my local. But I've never been to Africa, so that wouldn't be my local, even though that is a big part of who I am and the languages I've learned and my history. But I think for audiences as well is there. I guess I would say I'm trying to like spew it all together. I would say my thought for local is the land. That would be where I would kind of put that two and two together. Would be for the artists, for the audiences, for the personnel. It's the land that you consider home, and it's the land that you are on.
And that ties into what you were saying in terms of the First Nations people being the first caretakers of this land, the first stewards of it. Never is the land owned by anyone. It's just taken care of and shepherded and stewarded, which helps us frame that, I think. And also when we think about all of these different people with all of these, whether someone's a first generation Haligonian or third generation or come up through the Indigenous community, it's which stories we have license to tell as being our stories as a local person. And actually, I had a really cool conversation with Rebecca Thomas about this, who was the Poet Laureate in Halifax, and we commissioned a piece from her. And Laura Scroy last year, which was awesome. And we had a lot of traditional concert goers who were vocally said they were quite nervous about coming because they thought they were going to get told off for being white and for being settlers.
And she's amazing with her words.
She's a goddess.
Yeah,
she's an absolute
she's
goddess.
A friend of Prismatic. So we have her all the time.
she's one of those people you meet and you just think, oh, if I had even a fraction as much coolness in me that you do.
I agree.
She's one of the coolest people I've ever met.
She's so cool.
But we had this great discussion about, well, whose story is it? And she was like, but it's a shared story. It's not just an Indigenous story. It's also a settler community story. And it's a recent immigrant story. And we're all part of the understanding and the retelling and the writing and the future shaping of that story. It's not just... And that's the bit that I think is so important to get hold of, is that we're all connected to that story. And we're all... witnesses to it and writers of it and actors of it and shapers of it. Okay, absolutely. So to finish off with, because as you know, you've probably worked out, I think classical music has an awful lot to learn from other art forms and other people. I love it and I love what we do and I love my colleagues and I love our audience members, but we are very backward looking, and I mean that historically. We're sort of teleological in a way. We're constantly referring back to the past, and our values are built on the past, the values of the past, and we've carried them forward. And increasingly for classical performers all over the world, that's becoming a real, and audience members, I think, and board members, as boards become a little more open and interesting and populated by a broader cross section of society. It's a set of values that it does come under question a little bit. So for you, not only as artistic director of a festival that is blatantly open and about expansion of people and ideas and representation, but also as someone who deals with multidisciplinary stuff, what nuggets of advice could you give if you could help us in the classical music community? What little nuggets of advice would you have for us?
Oh, that's a big one. I think, the most, I guess, obvious one that I could kind of put out there is have an open mind, which obviously you've kind of touched on. But I think it's also, respecting that, there are some guiding principles from the past that are really important, that I think can shape, who you are and what your canon is, or what the whole classical music world is as a whole. But it's understanding, it's recognizing, and it's being open to move forward. And I think for us, when I've talked to any artists of color or musicians particularly that are in the classical world, the one thing that kind of comes up is there's always plenty of barriers. Whether that's, just like comments or faint dismissals in the place that you're working, or if there's racism in the workplace, or just fully being shut out and not having those opportunities. I think it's really important that to understand that, classical music is a blank canvas for you to tell your story, just like every other piece of music is. And if there are stories that have been told in the past that are continuing to be told, I think that's great, and I think that's important for sure. But it's just having that open mind and being able to let, that 12-year-old kid who heard Mozart and was like, I want to be a classical pianist, and then is also from an Indigenous community in Nova Scotia and wants to bring, some of those sounds into it, and to merge the worlds together. And I think, I kind of touched on it before, but I think just learning how to coexist, learning how to open your mind and have recognition of what has been some of the traumas from the past that you need to leave behind in the past and not bring forward. What are some of the beautiful things from the past that you want to bring forward? And what now can we do, can we say, can we learn to move forward?
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you
that came
much.
out well.
I was like, it was fantastic. Yeah, no, I 100% concur. Raeesa, it's been so nice to chat to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do hope that, well, first of all, that Prismatic will continue to flourish and expand and release its joyousness into the community. And I can't wait to actually be there for long enough to come and see some stuff.
Absolutely.
And to meet you in person, which will be a treat. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening to us talking around these topics. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it's been provocative. I hope it's given you food for thought. If you have any responses, any ideas, any requests, any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. There will be details at the end of this video so that you have a way of getting in touch with us and letting us know what you've thought and what you'd like us to talk about maybe in future videos as well. So thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Raeesa, again. It's been great chatting to you.
During these challenging times, we believe it's essential to continue working with community organizations that help bring people together, even when we're apart. And that's why we're supporting 60 music and cultural festivals in a safe way across Canada this summer through the TD Ready commitment.